Romantasy isn't just popular, it's record-breaking. Just look at Oynx Storm, the latest book in Rebecca Yarros's The Empyrean Cycle, which recently sold more copies in a single week than any other adult fiction book on record. These books aren't just bestsellers, they're reshaping the publishing landscape. Readers are devouring them, TikTok is obsessed with them, and publishers are chasing the trend. Even Hollywood has taken notice, with Fourth Wing and many others following suit, getting major streaming adaptations. Which, at this point, Fourth Wings does seem like it's going to happen, unlike acotar's, which, unfortunately, has kicked the bucket. Yet, despite its growing popularity, the general consensus is that these books are, at best, bad, guilty pleasures that should be consumed with a side of shame, and at worst, heralding the downfall of literature. Like Rhysand, Xaden, and Hawke are personally the 3 brooding horsemen of the literature apocalypse. But as a staunch defender of Romantasy, with all of its tropes and 19-year-old love interests, I want to talk about a little bit more about what Romantasy is, why it matters, and where it came from. This is a defense of Romantasy. Hi, my name is Michelle. If you haven't met me before, I talk about books on this channel, both reading them and much more occasionally writing them. And I love Romantasy. It is like absolutely my favorite genre of book to read. And I feel like recently, I think in light of kind of the huge success that Oynx Storm had, I've seen a lot of discourse about how Romantasy is just like really not good fiction, like it is bad fiction. And I want to talk about that. I want to interrogate that because I just don't think that is true. I don't think these millions of women are just like reading terrible books. I will also get into some of the flaws of the Romantasy genre because I don't think it's perfect. Before we can launch into Romantasy, we should probably talk about what genre is in general. At its core, it's a marketing tool. It tells Barnes & Noble where to stick the books in the bookstore. But it's also a very necessary tool from publishing houses in the book industry at large. I think sometimes when we talk about publishing as this industry, we picture these like big boardrooms filled with like men in suits with like briefcases who are like evilly twirling their mustaches and trying to think about ways to get you to buy the latest special edition because they put new cover art on it. But in all actuality, the publishing industry is largely filled with people who love books. While it is true that 95% of a book's success can be reduced to its marketing budget, that budget is determined by a team of publishing professionals who have a good sense of what kind of books and stories will appeal broadly to readers. And the truth is, most people in publishing do like really love books. They love stories. Marketing, of course, is about selling books, but like the best marketing happens when publishers are able to get the correct books into the right hands of readers. Everyone in publishing wants you to enjoy what you're reading, except for Jeff. And we can't get into the specifics of how Amazon is like completely changing the publishing industry today, but like unfortunately, Jeff does control a massive swath of the book industry, and Jeff doesn't care if you like what you're reading. He really does just want your money. Genre exists because we as readers want to know what to expect when we pick up a book. There's an unspoken agreement that happens between reader and writer. In his YouTube lecture series, which is a must-watch if you are a writer of any sort, Brandon Sanderson calls this idea the promise of the premise. The idea that a story should deliver, or even better, over-deliver on what the reader's expectation is going into that story. And that bad reviews most of the time come from disappointed readers who were not served what they were expecting. Everyone wins when we are clear about what a story is about. So what is Romantasy and why is everyone so obsessed with it? Before we can talk about Romantasy, I think we need to talk a little bit about fantasy. There are kind of 2 main theories about how Romantasy works. Is Romantasy a subsect of romance that has magic in it? Or is it a subsect of fantasy that has romance in it? Or is it just like a little piece in the center of the diagram that overlaps them? I would more firmly put it under fantasy. Fantasy as a genre has long been about power. It's about kings and kingdoms, chosen ones, good and evil, wars and conquest. Romantasy is about power too. It just looks a little different than we might expect. The definitions we have for Romantasy aren't great. I've even heard people say that it's just a label we slap on fantasy written by women. And I don't feel that's true because 1, there are a lot of fantasy books written by women that would not be really Romantasy books at all. And also I feel a Romantasy book could be written by a man. I mean, I have never personally read one, but like it could happen. I'm not ruling it out. The definition that I've always used is this one. Romantasy is a fantasy in which romance is the central driver of the plot. The rest of the story could not happen without the romance at its core. But even that definition is lacking something. By that logic, House of the Dragon could be considered a Romantasy. House of the Dragon, if you're not familiar, is a spin-off of the Game of Thrones series. It centers around 2 women, which seems to be a check in the right direction towards Romantasy: Rhaenyra Targaryen and Alicent Hightower. It largely centers around these two women's romantic relationships, whether it's with their uncle, their king, or the random knight who is personally my least favorite character on the show. Ew. Boo. Their romantic entanglements don't just add drama to the plot, they drive the plot, setting the stage for betrayals, power struggles, and ultimately, war. The story does not happen without these women kissing people and getting married. And yet the story would feel completely out of place in the Romantasy category. Why? Because while the House of the Dragon features relationships, they aren't framed in the way that Romantasies typically frame romance. The show isn't particularly concerned with emotional growth or personal intimacy. It's about strategy, power, and a crown. The relationships are often transactional, fraught with political consequences, and overwhelmingly shaped by the male character's ambitions rather than the female character's desires. The show centers around the men around Rhaenyra and Alicent, their thirst for control, their toxic influence. Love interests in Romantasy are allowed to be a little bit evil, as a treat. But they have to get better, and above all, they need to prioritize their relationship above anything else. But these guys just keep getting worse, and also sometimes kind of gross. And even though romance plays a critical role, the story's core theme, a desire for power's sake, places it firmly outside of the Romantasy genre. Meanwhile, another series, Throne of Glass, often gets lumped into Romantasy, despite that romance isn't at all central to the plot. In Throne of Glass, no spoilers, Selena Starthothian, the best assassin in all of Ardelane, who happens to be 17, is plucked from a prison camp and thrown into a deadly competition to become the king's champion. Along the way, she finds herself entangled in a love triangle between Prince Dorian and Captain Kale. But ultimately, her mission, to win her freedom, has little to do with both of these men, and she could be completely successful even if they were both just her friends. The romance is present, but it is completely secondary to Selena's own journey of self-discovery. And yet, Throne of Glass feels at home in the Romantasy space in a way that House of the Dragon never would. And even if I wouldn't personally define it as Romantasy, its tone, character arcs, and emotional beats align more with the genre's core themes: female agency, personal stake, and a heroine's journey towards reclaiming her power for the good of her world and her community. So clearly there's something deeper that separates Romantasy from other fantasy stories with romance as a central driver. But what and why? My theory, it has to do with where these stories came from. All novels are in conversation with everything that's come before them. It's another key feature of genre. It allows us to understand what expectations we should bring into a story. Most modern high fantasy stories are at least somewhat descendants of Tolkien. Of course, the canon is significantly broader than that, but Tolkien built a lot of the structure that fantasy readers have come to expect. So where the heck did Romantasy come from? What book shaped our modern understanding of the hallmarks of this genre? To answer that, we have to look to the one and only Miss Stephenie Meyer, of course. Before we launch into this section on Twilight's impact on the Romantasy genre, I would be completely remiss not to mention ContraPoint's video on Twilight. It is truly one of my favorite videos on the internet. It is like 3 hours long, and I think I've watched it 3 times because it is fantastic, and it dives significantly deeper into the reason why we find Twilight as a story so compelling and discusses like the romance genre as a whole. Now, obviously, romance novels that blended romance and fantastical elements existed long before Twilight, but Twilight was a cultural event. It was the gateway into the female gaze and speculative fiction, the introduction to the monstrous love interest, the blueprint to the enemies to lovers dynamic for most millennial women. It wasn't the first, but it was certainly the biggest. It gave us a generation of readers who grew up and wanted books that made them feel that same way again. And so we start to get these stories that have the same rhythm. They typically start with this girl who's disempowered by her current place in life, whether that's from being poor, being constrained by her role in society, or by her terrible family, or by being the new girl in town, or perhaps all of the above. She has no real power, no real agency to determine the outcome of her life. Then in comes the love interest. It's typically enemies to lovers in these sorts of books, and the love interest tends to be some big, brooding male. And this man almost always has power. Maybe not the exact kind of power that the heroine is interested in, but is essentially more powerful than her. And there's something extremely compelling about these mysterious, brooding men who could kill our heroine, and maybe even want to kill our heroine, but they don't because they're so obsessed with her. Romance ensues, and by the end of the story, often these women wind up getting powers, often powers that make them stronger than even the boys they started kissing at the beginning of the story. A particularly compelling heroine's journey, if you will. While I won't pretend that Romantasy doesn't share any common lineage with the traditional fantasy novel, I think the heart of the Romantasy novel is essentially vampires. We can even see that in some of the bestsellers in the genre in the moment. From Blood and Ash, Vampires. Quicksilver. Vampires. Serpent in the Wings of Night. Vampires. Okay. Let's take a look at the most popular Romantasy series. acotar. I can hear you now. Those are fae men. Those aren't vampires. Okay. Look at this man. He has literal bat wings. He can read minds. He can control minds. He's a 500-year-old obsessed with a 19-year-old. But he's not a vampire? Okay, sure. But this guy, you say, certainly not him. He's blonde. Well, calm down. He also can turn into a wolf. And does so. And does bite our heroine. I do believe he might be Jacob in this story. In fact, if you look closely, acotar, in a lot of respects, almost reads just like Edward and Jacob here are dressed up to go to the Renaissance Festival. I'm not going to get into Fourth Wing here because I think the vampire allegations could be made more in the later books, but we certainly have the brooding love interest at the core. And as we get into later books, the vampire allegation could be made, and pretty strongly. It's certainly not true across the board, but a majority of the big names, the books that have whispers of movie deals, the books that are selling millions of copies, are vampires all the way down. Even if the specifics of the stories aren't vampires, the dynamics of Twilight are almost always visible at the core of these stories. Romantasy readers, and probably more importantly writers, are people who grew up while Twilight was dominating culture. When these readers who devoured Twilight as teens grew up, they wanted something that still felt like Twilight, but with something with more juice. Something to satisfy our Twilight craving for an audience that hadn't been 17 in a while. And that's where I think the infamous new adult category tried and failed to come in. New adult wasn't really ever a genre, but it also really wasn't an age bracket. It was this weird grouping of books, both mostly contemporary fiction and fantasy books, that were slotted together with these young 20-something heroines, or an attempt to slot together these young 20-something heroines. They tended to be higher on the spicy scale and read really fast-paced. They read like the early 2000s YA novels. It was a marketing label and one I never particularly loved. 20-somethings do not need a separate section in the bookstore. Age categories serve an incredibly important purpose in the publishing world. They make distinctions and reading level and themes and topics, but new adult was all about vibes. I think for the most part, this category has kind of crumbled in recent years, and I think honestly that's for the best. But I do think Romantasy has become kind of a subgenre of its own that has taken those new adult readers and given them a place to call home within the fantasy genre. One of the biggest critiques I see of Romantasy is that it's just bad fantasy, that the world building is weak, the political structures are vague, the conflicts are simplistic. But here's the thing, Romantasy isn't trying to be traditional high fantasy. It's a character-driven genre that prioritizes personal stakes over institutional stakes. It's not that the world building doesn't exist, it's just not the core of the story. There are only so many words in a book, and it's not the priority in these ones. These books are about what it feels like to be a young woman, disenfranchised and disempowered by her world, and how these heroines reclaim that power. When we talk about Romantasy as if it is less than, there's an implicit assumption that the pursuit of male power is aspirational, while the pursuit of female power is self-indulgent. One of the most frustrating critiques of the genre is that it's merely wish fulfillment, that because these stories are centered around women's, and particularly young women's, wants and desires, that these novels are somehow shallow and frivolous. But desire is the foundation of compelling storytelling. Characters need to want things. That's literally how plot works. And yet, when women's desires take central stage, whether that is romantic, sexual, or personal fulfillment, it's often dismissed as shallow. But why? Why is it fine for a male protagonist to want power, revenge, adventure, but it's frivolous for a female protagonist to want love, romance, and a life of her own choosing? This isn't new. Just look at Jane Austen's famous opening line of Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. It's often seen as a satirical line because the men in these stories don't need marriage. Well, of course, there is societal pressure for these wealthy men to gain wives. It's a different kind of pressure than for the Bennet sisters, who will literally be homeless if they do not find husbands. Romance for them isn't just a matter of desire, or even a matter of living up to those societal expectations. It is a means of survival. For women at the heart of these stories, often the only way they will have access to substantial power is through the men around them. When Greta Gerwig set out to adapt Little Women, she wanted modern readers to better understand Amy. Often in our collective imaginations, Amy was seen as shallow and weak, a foil to Jo's more bold and ambitious approach to life. Greta wanted us to see that Amy's desire for marriage isn't stupid or naive, it's practical. If I had my own money, which I don't, that money would belong to my husband the moment we got married. And if we had children, they would be his, not mine. They would be his property. So don't sit there and tell me that marriage isn't an economic proposition, because it is. It may not be for you, but it most certainly is for me. For women, romance has always been about power. economic power, social power, bodily autonomy. In Romantasy, love isn't just a subplot. It's often the thing that allows the heroine to reclaim agency, to forge a new path outside the structures that would control her. Another big criticism of Romantasy and genre fiction in general is its reliance on tropes. The enemies to lovers dynamic, the only one bed dilemma, fake dating, the marriage of convenience. These recurring patterns are often dismissed as lazy storytelling, as if originality can only exist in total rejection of the familiar. But tropes are to storytelling what poetic structures are to poetry. Whether that's a haiku or a sonnet or a villanelle, these forms aren't restrictive, they're frameworks that allow for infinite variations in creativity. The same applies to Romantasy or any other genre that relies on tropes. These books take well-loved patterns and breathe a new life into them, remixing and interpreting them in ways that feel fresh. The tension between the familiar and the novel isn't a flaw, it's the foundation of storytelling itself. We return to certain structures because they resonate, because they reflect something fundamental about how we see the world. Can tropes be used poorly? Of course. A book that merely regurgitates what's come before without depth or originality can feel empty. Tropes aren't a substitute for rich characters or compelling plots, but they aren't the enemy of good storytelling. They're tools, ones that in the right hands allow for an extraordinary range of expression. Stories have always been communal in this way. We whisper them back and forth to each other, shaping and reshaping them to reflect our hopes, our fears, our realities. Tropes aren't a limitation, they're part of the shared language. And women, so often the keepers of oral tradition, of myths, and of fairy tales, have always understood this. Through stories, the personal becomes communal, and the communal then becomes personal again. There's a sense of shared knowledge that is passed through these stories, a lineage of narratives that evolve with each retelling. Just as fairy tales were once whispered from mother to daughter, shaping and reshaping them to fit the needs of each generation, Romantasy continues this tradition, telling stories that affirm women's autonomy, resilience, and inner strength. These books, just like the fairy tales before them, don't just entertain, they guide. They whisper to readers that they are not alone, that their struggles matter, and that reclaiming one's power, whether literal or emotional, is possible. Again and again, these stories seek to empower women, reminding them that their lives and choices are important, that their desires and dreams deserve space. Their morals may sometimes seem simple, but they are the kind of truths we need to hear again and again. Love is worth fighting for. You are worthy of happiness. You can build a life of your own choosing. These messages, though sometimes dismissed as too simple or sentimental, have always been and will always be necessary. This communal storytelling tradition is more alive than ever in the digital age. Social media has created a new kind of oral tradition, one that mirrors the way that women have always shared and reshaped stories. Fandom spaces are filled with readers engaging in a centuries-old practice, taking stories and fusing them with their own lived experiences and passing them on with new meaning. They analyze, reinterpret, and retell. They make art, expand character arcs, debate theories, not as passive consumers, but as active participants in shaping modern mythology. It's storytelling in motion, an ever-evolving dialogue where the personal becomes communal, and the communal becomes personal again. To dismiss Romantasy for using tropes is to misunderstand what storytelling is, and has always been. A conversation, centuries in the making. Okay, here's where the truth comes out. I'm not saying that all Romantasy books are good. In fact, I've read a lot of bad Romantasy books. Books whose plots aren't internally consistent, whose characters absolutely give us nothing, that are boring, whose plots make no sense. There is a lot of bad books out there. That's probably true in any genre. Here's the thing about popular fiction. It's actually really hard to write well. There's a great Lorde quote that I absolutely love where she talks about pop music. She says, "A lot of musicians think they can do pop, and the ones who don't succeed are the ones who don't have the reverence, who think it's a dumb version of other music. You need to be awestruck." I think that applies to popular fiction too. Writing books that connect with millions of people isn't easy. There's an incredible level of skill that is necessary to create compelling three-dimensional characters, to structuring stories to keep readers hooked, and to delivering the emotional beats that make people cry, scream, and pass it on to their best friend. There's a certain kind of reader or critic who loves to declare that books aren't as good as they used to be, that publishing is in decline, that Romantasy, or really any genre that is trending, is really proof of literature's downfall. But sweeping generalizations like this ignore the way that the market has changed. It's harder than ever to make a living as a mid-list author, thanks in large part to algorithms that dictate much of the book industry. Thanks again, Jeff. He's still here, still causing problems. Authors are under increasing pressure to fit their works into these algorithms and to do it quickly, to create books that fit neatly into trends, because algorithms work by recommending things that are already doing well and things similar to that. While your local bookstore can hand recommend books based on complex emotional resonance, algorithms rely on tropes, plot structures, and keywords. I know I just talked about how tropes aren't inherently bad, and I stand by that. When we use tropes as a checklist of things that we must get in every single book, we do not leave enough room for the innovation that leads to incredible storytelling. At the same time, we also have, on the other end of things, the rise of self-publishing and platforms like TikTok, which makes it possible for books that never would have hit to gain an audience without a massive marketing budget. This means more books are getting published and more readers are finding what they love, but it also means that there's an avalanche of content, and not all of it is good. So, is Romantasy perfect? No. Are there bad books in the genre? Of course. But does that mean the entire genre is a blight on literature? Absolutely not. Books are shaped by the systems that produce them, and right now that system favors fast, trope-driven stories that appeal to broad audiences. That doesn't mean that good books aren't being written. It just means they have to survive in an ecosystem that is evolving. The R-rated side of romance. This section is actually the reason I decided to make the video, particularly this headline. I get really frustrated with this genre that means so much to me and so many other people. It gets reduced to just the spicy content. Not because these books aren't spicy, but because it's not an honest depiction of a genre that has millions of readers. A lot of Romantasy features explicit scenes, and the discourse around that often reduces books to just that. Because, let's be real, smut is political. The reclamation of women's bodies to serve female pleasure is political. There was literally a bill in Oklahoma attempting to make writing these sort of books criminal. Sort of. Right now, it seems like the bill, as written, would mostly apply to explicit visual depiction, but the language is fairly vague, and it's unclear if this could be used more broadly to make romance novels with explicit scenes criminal. Regardless, with the rise of book banning, everyone's a little on edge, and that makes a lot of sense. Because if you control the media people consume, you control how they understand the world. This isn't just about books. This is about who gets to tell stories and what stories are allowed to be told. In his latest book, The Message, Ta-Nehisi Coates says this: "Politics is the art of the possible, but art creates the possible of politics. Novels, memoirs, paintings, sculptures, statues, monuments, films, miniseries, advertisements, and journalism all order our reality. Jim Crow segregation, with its signage and cap-doffing rituals, was both policy and a kind of public theater. The arts tell us what is possible and what is not, because, among other things, they tell us who is human and who is not." I want to be clear. I think novels that are centered around female pleasure are important. Reclaiming sexuality as empowering for our heroines, reclaiming agency over their own bodies is important. But when people reduce Romantasy to just spice, it's usually not a celebration of the importance of this sort of writing, but a way to explain away their popularity. Why do women like these stories? Oh, it's because it's like they have strippers in their head. Many of these books are 500 plus pages long, yet only contain a handful of explicit scenes. Not to mention some books, like Powerless, don't contain explicit scenes at all. But you wouldn't know that from the headlines. Coverage of Fourth Wing fixated on its sex scenes, despite the fact they make up only a tiny fraction of the book. Female pleasure in literature is treated as scandalous, overshadowing the actual stories being told. That's not why women love these books, because trust me, you could find a lot spicier out there. Women are not getting tattoos like this because Cassian said, "Put your hands on the headboard." Or like this because Xaden has some creative ideas about activities that could be done in the throne room. Or like this because there was only one bed at that inn. These are not stories of hot men who happen to have women in them. These are stories about empowered women that happen to fall in love with hot men. Men that encourage them and give them access to more power. Men that improve their lives. These stories are passed from woman to woman between best friends and sisters because they see themselves in these books. They see who they want to become. And that's why these books matter. Okay, now we're to the bad news. Told you I was going to talk about some flaws. I think the biggest flaw, and it is like a very major flaw and something I would be remiss not to talk about in the Romantasy genre, is how intensely white it is. While Romantasies are certainly being written by BIPOC authors, it is much rarer to see a breakout success. On the whole, the romance genre is one of the most diverse genres in terms of authors, but Romantasy does not have the same breakdown. There didn't seem to be a ton of research done into this, but I've linked a couple articles down below that further discuss this problem. But here's what Jeff Kennedy, who is the president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association, in an interview with Paste Magazine, had to say about the issue of diversity within Romantasy. "My biggest concern regarding Romantasy is how publishing's eagerness to embrace the subgenre is going hand in hand with slipping on or abandoning commitments to diversity. Booktok is the power behind Romantasy's rise and the driving force of sales right now. But Booktok also has a racism problem baked into its algorithm. As long as retailers prioritize titles based on TikTok popularity and publishers Mind this for sales. How can BIPOC authors expect to have the same explosive success as top-selling white romantasy authors? What can we do as an industry to level the playing field, even if it means going against TikTok? Romantasy isn't just a passing trend. It's a genre that speaks to a generation of readers who crave stories centered on personal power, relationships, and desire. It blends the grand, sweeping narratives of fantasy with the emotional depth of romance, creating something uniquely compelling. The backlash against romantasy often reveals more about how we view women's stories than it does about the books themselves. These stories might not always align with traditional fantasy expectations, but they don't have to. Romantasy has created its own lane, a genre shaped by its influences, but not beholden to them. Romantasy refuses to apologize for being both emotional and epic, both sensual and serious. And for readers who have spent years being told that the stories they love are silly or shallow, that refusal is its own kind of revolution. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed making it and talking about it. I could talk for like 27 years. This like really just like skims the surface on my thoughts on romantasy, but I hope it was like helpful. If you have thoughts on romantasy, please leave them in the comments down below. It's my literal favorite thing. And if you are interested in spending more time with me, I would love to have you. We're about to start a recap of the acotar series, and I will be taking that series slowly, going through all of it, sharing my thinks and my thoughts on a series that I have read and loved. And probably, like, I would say the queen of this genre, Miss Sarah J. Maas. So I will see you in the next one. Hope you have a great day. Bye.